Karen Haras's teen wearing Harris-Walz hat, only to learn his dad is a governor. The air outside the small shopping complex was crisp, the late afternoon sun casting golden streaks across the parking lot. Groups of people moved in and out of the store entrances. Parents herding their children, older couples strolling hand in hand, and teens clustered in loud, laughing groups. Among them was a quiet teenager named Luke Warren. He wasn't drawing much attention as he walked casually toward a hardware store, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, the brim of his red, white, and blue Harris-Walz hat shielding his eyes. To Luke, it was just another day, a boring errand his mom had sent him on to grab a couple of supplies for the house. He'd parked his bike near the store entrance, swung his leg off it, and was making his way toward the automatic doors when a sharp voice cut through the hum of background noise. "Excuse me. You, yes you." Luke glanced up instinctively, his brow furrowing. A middle-aged woman in a red and white striped shirt and a puffy navy vest was striding toward him, her expression a mix of fury and disgust. She had the look of someone who had decided unilaterally that the day was going to revolve around her, and that Luke was going to be her next target. For a split second, Luke wondered if she had mistaken him for someone else. He slowed his pace slightly, unsure if he should engage, but before he could decide, the woman was in front of him, blocking his path. "That hat," she snapped, jabbing her finger in his direction. "Take it off. Right now." Luke blinked, startled. "What?" I said. "Take it off," she repeated, her voice rising. Her finger jabbed at the brim of his Harris-Walz cap like it offended her on a molecular level. "You think it's funny walking around here like that? You think it's some kind of joke?" Luke stared at her, completely bewildered. "It's just a hat," he said slowly, his voice calm but cautious. "What's the problem?" "The problem," the woman hissed, stepping closer, "is that people like you think you can just shove your beliefs in everyone's face. That hat is offensive, and I'm not going to stand for it. Do you even know what it represents? Do you have any idea what kind of message you're sending by wearing it?" Luke opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What message? He was just wearing a hat his dad had given him. A hat that had meant nothing more to him than a cool, patriotic design. But before he could say that, the woman pressed on, her anger spiraling into a lecture. "People like you need to learn that actions have consequences," she said, her voice sharp enough to turn heads from passers-by. "You don't get to walk around flaunting that kind of divisive nonsense. This is a community store, and people like you aren't welcome here if you can't show a little respect." Luke felt heat rising in his face, a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and frustration. "Lady, I'm just here to grab some tools," he said firmly. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not bothering anyone." "Oh, you're bothering me," she shot back, her tone venomous. "And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Just look at you, parading around like you own the place, trying to stir up trouble." Luke glanced around, his eyes darting to the people nearby. A small crowd was starting to gather, a couple of shoppers lingering near the entrance, a mother with her toddler pausing mid-step to watch. Their curious glances made Luke's chest tighten. He didn't like being the center of attention, especially for something as ridiculous as this. "I don't own anything," he muttered, trying to sidestep her. "Can you please let me through?" But the woman wasn't done. She planted herself even more firmly in his path, her finger jabbing toward his chest this time. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere. Not until you take that hat off. I don't care what your excuse is. I have every right to demand you show a little decency in public." Luke exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "You don't have any right to tell me what to wear," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not doing anything wrong. You're the one making this a problem, not me." The woman's face turned a deeper shade of red, her eyes narrowing. "How dare you talk to me like that?" she snapped, loud enough that a man near the parking lot actually paused and turned to look. "I'm trying to teach you a little respect, and you clearly didn't learn any from your parents. I should call the manager and have you thrown out of here." Luke's fists clenched inside his hoodie pockets, his jaw tightening as anger bubbled up inside him. She had no idea what she was talking about, But that didn't stop her from making assumptions or insulting his family. He glanced around again, noticing that more people were stopping to stare. The murmurs had grown louder, some confused, some disapproving, though whether it was toward Luke or the woman, he couldn't tell. "Are you seriously trying to get me kicked out of a store because of a hat?" Luke asked, disbelief edging into his voice. "Yes, I am," the woman declared, her chin lifting triumphantly. "Someone has to do something about the disrespect people like you are spreading. And if no one else is willing to, I'll do it myself." Luke let out an incredulous laugh. "Lady, you don't even know me." "I don't have to know you," she shot back. "The hat says enough. You're just another troublemaker looking to cause a scene." "I wasn't causing a scene until you started yelling at me," Luke pointed out, his voice sharp now. "I was just minding my own business." The woman ignored him, turning to a man who had stopped nearby. "Do you see this?" she demanded, gesturing toward Luke as if presenting evidence in a trial. "Do you see the kind of disrespect these kids have? Walking around in hats like that, spreading their garbage opinions everywhere. It's shameful." The man shifted uncomfortably, looking between her and Luke. I don't think he's doing anything wrong," he muttered, clearly not wanting to get involved. "Of course you don't," she spat, throwing her hands up. "That's the problem with this generation. No one has any spine anymore." Luke shook his head, his frustration mounting with every word that came out of her mouth. "You need to back off," he said firmly, his voice louder now. "I'm not doing anything to you. You're the one causing the problem here. How dare you speak to me like that?" she snapped, pointing her finger inches from his face. "You have no respect. No respect at all. Someone needs to teach you a lesson." By now, the scene had fully captured the attention of everyone nearby. Shoppers stood frozen in place, their eyes locked on the escalating argument. The woman's voice was loud, sharp, and impossible to ignore, her accusations echoing through the air like sirens. And Luke, his face red with frustration, his fists still clenched inside his hoodie, stood his ground. The woman's finger hovered inches from Luke's face, trembling slightly with indignation. Her voice had risen to a shrill crescendo that echoed across the storefront, drowning out the sounds of car doors shutting and the low hum of passing conversations. "Kids like you think you can do whatever you want. Well, not today. I won't stand for this. Do you hear me? You will take that hat off." Luke's jaw clenched as he took a half step back, his heart thudding in his chest. "Lady, you need to calm down. You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit her like a slap. Her mouth fell open for a moment before she recovered, her face twisting with rage. "Embarrassing myself?" she screeched, loud enough for heads to turn across the parking lot. "You're the one walking around like some little provocateur, throwing garbage political nonsense in people's faces." Luke shook his head in disbelief, his fists balling tighter in his hoodie pockets. "It's just a hat," he shot back, his voice rising despite his best effort to stay calm. "You're the only one making a scene here. I didn't do anything to you." "Nothing?" The woman's voice crackled with venom as she whipped around toward the growing crowd. "Did you hear that? He says he did nothing, as if walking around in that hat isn't an act of aggression. These kids, they think they can wear this divisive trash and not get called out for it." Murmurs rippled through the bystanders now, some exchanging confused glances, others whispering under their breath. A man in a navy jacket, holding a coffee cup, sighed and muttered, "Lady, let the kid be. He's just standing there." The woman snapped her head toward him like a hawk locking on prey. "You think this is okay? That's the problem. People like you letting this kind of behavior slide. That's why the world's a mess." Luke couldn't help but laugh bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't even know me. You're yelling at a teenager over a hat. Do you even hear yourself?" Her eyes widened, and she pointed an accusing finger at him again. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You think you're smart, huh? You think you can disrespect me and get away with it? I don't care whose kid you are. Someone needs to put you in your place." The words landed like a hammer, loud enough that the crowd stiffened in unison. A woman holding a stroller gasped audibly, shooting Luke a sympathetic glance. A teenager near the door pulled out his phone, quietly recording the unfolding scene as the woman's tirade escalated. "You've got no right to—" "Oh, I've got every right," she interrupted, practically shrieking now. "People like you are what's wrong with this country. Walking around with that disgusting hat, acting like you're better than everyone else. You're just a little punk looking for attention." Luke's ears burned, and his heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The crowd was larger now. 10, maybe 15 people lingering, all eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Some stood silently, their expressions tense and uncomfortable. Others exchanged pointed looks, clearly forming opinions about the woman's behavior. From the corner of his eye, Luke spotted an older man near the edge of the crowd, his face stern as he shook his head. "Leave the kid alone," the man called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "He hasn't done anything to you." The woman spun on him instantly, her anger shifting like a spotlight. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice shaking. "People like him think they can shove their beliefs in our faces and just walk away. I won't stand for it." "And what exactly did he do?" The man fired back, unflinching. "Stand there quietly while you yelled at him? Grow up." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. Luke exhaled sharply, relieved that someone had finally spoken up. For a moment, he considered stepping away, just leaving the whole ridiculous situation behind. But as he shifted his weight, the woman caught the movement and lunged toward him again, her finger wagging wildly. "Oh no, you don't," she shouted. "You're not walking away from this. You think you can wear that hat and not face the consequences? That's not how the world works. Kid." Luke's frustration boiled over, his voice firm as he stared her down. "You're the only one making a problem out of this. It's just a hat. You don't get to tell me what I can or can't wear." The woman's face contorted, her hands shaking at her sides. "Oh, you'll regret talking to me like that," she hissed. "I'll make sure of it." Luke felt a chill run through him, but he refused to back down. "Do whatever you want," he said, his voice calm but defiant. "I'm not taking it off because you don't like it." The woman let out a sound somewhere between a scoff and a laugh, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Fine," she sneered. "If you won't listen to me, then maybe someone else will make you listen. I'm going inside to find a manager. You're about to learn a hard lesson, kid." Luke watched as she spun on her heel and stormed toward the store entrance, her puffy vest rustling as she walked. He stood rooted to the spot, his chest heaving as the crowd murmured around him. "Unbelievable," someone muttered. "Poor kid," another said quietly. Luke glanced toward the older man who had defended him earlier. The man gave him a small nod, as if to say, "Hang in there." "Are you okay?" a voice asked from nearby. Luke turned to see a woman in her 30s holding a shopping bag, her face filled with concern. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his pulse was still racing. "Thanks." She shook her head. "Some people just look for someone to yell at. Don't let it get to you." Luke nodded, grateful for her words, but his eyes flickered back to the store entrance, where the woman had disappeared. His gut churned uneasily. Whatever she was planning, he knew it wasn't over, and he wasn't wrong. Minutes later, the automatic doors slid open again, and the woman emerged, flanked by a tall man in a store uniform. The crowd stirred, shifting to watch as they approached Luke. The woman's face was triumphant, her chin tilted high as though she'd already won some great battle. "There he is," she said loudly, pointing toward Luke. "He's the one causing the disturbance. I told you he was a problem." The store manager looked at Luke, his brow furrowing. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his tone cautious. Luke's fists clenched again as the woman cut in before he could respond. "Yes, there's an issue," she snapped. "This punk refuses to take off that ridiculous hat. He's upsetting people, he's upsetting me. You need to handle this." Luke met the manager's gaze, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling under the surface. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The manager hesitated, looking between Luke and the woman, clearly unsure of how to handle the growing tension. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The store manager stood still for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the situation unfolding in front of him. His name tag read Gary, and he had the look of someone who was used to breaking up arguments over return policies, not refereeing full-blown public spectacles. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing between the woman's furious face and Luke, who stood his ground with a calm defiance that only seemed to infuriate her more. "Ma'am," Gary began cautiously, his tone placating. "Let's take a breath here. You're saying this young man is causing a disturbance?" "Yes," the woman barked, gesturing toward Luke as though he were a wild animal. "I told you, he's walking around in that hat, shoving his garbage politics in everyone's faces. I'm not the only one who's uncomfortable. Look at him. He's being disrespectful to me and to this store." Luke scoffed under his breath, unable to stop himself. "I haven't said a word to you other than to ask you to leave me alone." The woman whirled on him, her face twisted with indignation. "Oh, you've said plenty. That attitude of yours is the problem. You're what's wrong with kids today. No respect, no accountability, just walking around thinking you can do whatever you want without consequences." Gary held up his hands in an attempt to calm her down. "Ma'am, please, let's keep our voices down. This is still a public space." But she wasn't listening. Her voice was loud enough to echo through the storefront, each word punctuated by a jab of her finger in Luke's direction. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that has to be stopped. You let these kids wear trash like that, and before you know it, they're running around thinking they're in charge of everything." Luke shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "You keep calling it trash, but it's just a hat. You don't even know what you're talking about." Her face flushed an even deeper shade of red as she rounded on him again. "How dare you speak to me like that? I'm an adult. I don't need to know anything about your hat to know what it stands for. You're flaunting disrespect, and I won't let you get away with it." The crowd around them had grown larger now. People lingered near the doorways and sidewalks, openly watching the argument unfold like spectators at a boxing match. A few shoppers whispered quietly to one another, shaking their heads, while others stood with arms crossed, their faces etched with disapproval, though whether for Luke or the woman wasn't always clear. "Gary," the woman snapped, spinning back to face the manager. "Are you going to do your job or not? I told you, I don't feel safe with people like him in this store. You need to make him leave." Gary shifted awkwardly, his eyes flicking to Luke for a moment. "Ma'am, let me just, check on something real quick," he said, clearly stalling for time. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I'll need to verify." "Verify what?" she interrupted, exasperated. "Do I need to call corporate and tell them you refuse to remove someone who's clearly causing trouble? Do you want to lose your job over this?" Gary paled at the threat, and Luke could see the moment the manager's resolve started to crumble. The man turned back to Luke, his voice weaker now. "Kid, listen, can we just de-escalate this? Maybe it'd be easier if you just took the hat off." Luke's jaw dropped in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? I'm just trying to avoid more trouble," Gary replied, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You don't have to take it off forever, just while you're here. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Luke's voice was sharp, unwavering. "I'm not doing anything wrong. She's the one harassing me. Why don't you ask her to leave?" The woman let out a harsh laugh, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you serious? I'm the one harassing you? Oh, that's rich. You're just another disrespectful kid who thinks you're above everyone else. Let me tell you something. People like me built this country while people like you tear it apart." Luke's fists balled so tightly inside his hoodie pockets that his knuckles ached. He wanted to shout back, to tell her she didn't know anything about him or what he stood for, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. His dad always told him that sometimes silence was louder than words. Gary looked desperate now, clearly hoping to regain some control. "Look," he said, turning back to Luke. "Just give me a minute, okay? Let me sort this out. Ma'am, why don't we step inside for a moment? We'll figure this out." "I don't want to figure this out," she snapped, her voice rising again. "I want him gone. It's that simple. If you won't do your job, then I'll take care of this myself." Luke stiffened as the woman turned back toward him, stepping so close that he could smell the faint scent of perfume mixed with anger on her breath. "You need to learn your place, young man," she said, her voice low and dangerous now. "If your parents won't teach you respect, then someone else will. Stay away from me," Luke replied sharply, his shoulders tensing. "Or what?" she taunted, her smile cold and satisfied. "You gonna call for help? Maybe cry to mommy and daddy? Is that how you kids handle conflict these days?" The crowd gasped softly at her words. Even Gary looked shocked as he stepped forward, holding out his hands to separate them. "Okay, that's enough," he said, his voice more forceful now. "Ma'am, step back. You're going too far." "I'm going too far?" she demanded, her voice rising again. "This kid has been disrespecting me from the second I walked up here, and I'm the one in the wrong? You people are unbelievable." Luke finally snapped, his voice firm and unwavering. "You don't even know me. You don't know who I am, you don't know who my family is, and you definitely don't know what that hat means. You're just looking for someone to yell at because you're miserable." Her mouth fell open, stunned by his words, but before she could retort, the older man from the crowd spoke up again. "He's right, the man said, his tone even but sharp. You don't know him, and you're making yourself look ridiculous." The woman's face flushed deep red, but for the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. Gary, too, hesitated, his mouth opening as if to speak but closing again when nothing came out. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Luke stood his ground, his chin lifted defiantly. The woman's face twitched as she turned to glare at the older man who had spoken up, her hands trembling with fury. "Excuse me? I look ridiculous," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This kid is walking around flaunting." "Flaunting what, exactly?" The man shot back, unflinching. His sharp tone cut through the woman's indignation like a knife. "A hat? That's what set you off? You're embarrassing yourself." She froze for just a moment, her eyes darting between the man and the crowd, which had grown larger still. People were no longer hiding their reactions. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another, and a few were openly recording on their phones now. The woman seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation, and her voice sharpened as she tried to reestablish authority. "I'm not the one embarrassing myself here," she snapped, spinning back toward Luke. "He started this whole thing by wearing that hat. If you people don't see the problem, then you're part of it too." Gary, still hovering nearby, let out a weary sigh and tried to step in once again. "Ma'am, let's calm down. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Blowing it out of proportion?" she shrieked, throwing her arms in the air as if the crowd's ignorance was personally wounding her. "This is exactly why this country is falling apart. Everyone just lets things slide. No standards, no accountability, and no respect." Luke shook his head slowly, his voice flat. "It's a hat. That's all it is." She whirled back to him, her expression a mask of pure rage. "You really don't get it, do you? Kids like you're clueless. Walking around with your smug little attitude, acting like the world owes you something. Well, guess what? It doesn't. Maybe it's you who doesn't get it." Luke shot back, unable to stop himself. "You don't know me. You don't know what I stand for. You just saw something you didn't like, and now you're yelling at me to feel better about yourself." The woman's jaw tightened, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Watch your mouth, kid. I've been dealing with brats like you for years, and trust me, you're not as smart as you think you are." The crowd's murmurs grew louder now, some openly criticizing her behavior. "She's losing it," someone whispered. "Poor kid's just standing there." Another voice, closer, muttered, "Why doesn't someone step in and tell her to leave?" But no one did. Everyone seemed frozen, caught between fascination and discomfort, as though waiting to see what would happen next. The woman seemed to hear the comments and turned sharply toward the crowd, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, I see how it is," she sneered. "You're all just going to stand there and let this little punk get away with it? Fine, I'll handle this myself." Luke barely had time to react before she reached for his hat, her hand lunging toward him like a striking snake. He stepped back instinctively, his heart hammering in his chest as her fingers swiped at the air. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice loud and sharp. "What's your problem?" "Give me that hat," she snapped, trying again. "If you're not mature enough to take it off, I'll do it for you." Gary finally moved to step between them, his voice rising with alarm. "Ma'am, stop. You can't do that. Get out of my way," she barked, her face flushed and furious. "Someone has to do something about this." Luke stared at her in disbelief, his pulse pounding in his ears. The crowd had gone silent now, everyone watching as the situation spiraled even further out of control. People weren't just recording discreetly anymore. Several had their phones out, held up at eye level, capturing every second of the woman's tirade. The older man who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "You lay one hand on that kid, and I'll call the cops myself," he said, his tone icy and firm. "You're out of line, lady." She paused mid-step, her shoulders heaving with heavy, angry breaths. "I don't need anyone's permission to deal with this," she spat, gesturing toward Luke like he was a pile of garbage. "People like him, walking around spreading their garbage ideas. I'm sick of it. Someone needs to take a stand. You're the one causing the problem." Luke snapped back, unable to hold his tongue any longer. "You're yelling at a kid in front of an entire crowd because you don't like my hat. You don't know anything about me or what I stand for. You're just looking for someone to blame." For a moment, her face registered something that might have been doubt, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "You don't get to lecture me," she snarled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "You're right," Luke shot back, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I don't know you either, but at least I'm not yelling at strangers to make myself feel better." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a burst of murmured agreement. A woman near the front shook her head, whispering to the person next to her, "He's got a point. She's unhinged." Gary looked completely overwhelmed now, his hands held up as though to stop a runaway train. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Everyone, just calm down. Ma'am, I'm gonna have to ask you to step back. This is getting out of control." But the woman ignored him. She turned her glare back to Luke, her voice trembling with frustration. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "One day you'll understand how wrong you are. And when you do, I hope you remember me." Luke stared her down, his jaw tight. "I'll remember you. All right," he said quietly, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I'll remember how far some people will go to make themselves feel big." The crowd murmured louder at that, their disapproval now more obvious than ever. The woman seemed to sense the shift, her face twitching with barely concealed fury. She turned toward Gary again, desperate for some kind of support. "Are you really just going to stand there and let him disrespect me like this?" she demanded, her voice shrill and shaking. "This is your store. Do something." Gary opened his mouth, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Ma'am, I don't know what you want me to do," he admitted weakly. "He hasn't done anything wrong." The woman's jaw dropped, stunned into silence for the first time since she'd approached Luke. Her eyes darted toward the crowd, the bystanders whose faces were no longer sympathetic. The shift in tone was palpable now. She wasn't winning anymore, and she knew it. Still, she clenched her fists and turned back to Luke, her voice low and spiteful. "This isn't over," she muttered, her tone filled with bitterness. Luke didn't respond. He didn't need to. The crowd, the phones, and the looks of disapproval said enough. Luke held the woman's glare without flinching, but inside, he could feel the heat building behind his ribs. His chest rose and fell in tight breaths, though he forced his expression to remain calm. Around them, the crowd was practically buzzing now. Dozens of murmurs, stares, and camera phones pointed like laser beams at the chaos unfolding. A small group of teens nearby chuckled nervously, their eyes flicking between the woman's red face and Luke's defiant posture. "Do you see this?" the woman barked to no one in particular, spinning toward the growing crowd. "This is what's wrong with kids these days. No respect, no accountability, just walking around, stirring up trouble with their little statements." Well, I won't stand for it. You've said that like 10 times already, a voice from the crowd muttered. The woman's head snapped toward the voice like a vulture catching movement. Oh, so now you're going to lecture me? She hissed, her eyes narrowing. It's people like you, standing by while this kind of thing happens, that have ruined this country. Luke shook his head, biting back the sharp response rising in his throat. He glanced at the crowd, noticing more people trickling out of the store to see what was going on. Parents pulled their kids closer. Teens grinned as they recorded from a safe distance, and an older man off to the side let out an audible sigh, muttering to his wife, "She's gone off the rails." Gary, the store manager, was sweating now. The woman's anger had turned like a storm cloud, spilling over onto anyone who dared question her. He tried again, stepping between her and Luke. "Ma'am, please," he pleaded, his voice thin. "Let's stop this. You're upsetting other customers. I don't think this young man has done anything to deserve." "Deserve?" she screeched, her voice cutting him off as she pointed directly at Luke again. "Oh, he deserves a lot more than this. He's standing there, bold as brass, in that ridiculous hat, mocking people like me, and you think I'm going to just let him stand there and smile? Not a chance." Luke let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you? I'm not mocking anyone. I'm just minding my business. You're the one yelling in a parking lot like a lunatic." Gasps echoed through the crowd. A teen nearby whispered, "Oh, he went there." The woman's face turned crimson, her fists clenching so tightly at her sides that her knuckles went white. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice dangerously low now. "Who raised you to be so disrespectful? What kind of parent lets their kid walk around like this? Talking back to adults and flaunting trash like that hat?" Luke's spine straightened, her words hitting a nerve. "Don't talk about my parents," he shot back, his voice cold and sharp. "Or what?" she sneered, stepping closer. "What are you going to do? You're just a little punk. Another spoiled brat who's never been told no in his life. Well, you're hearing it now. You do not get to walk around shoving your politics in people's faces without consequences." "This isn't about politics," Luke said evenly, though his voice trembled with restrained anger. "This is about you thinking you can bully people into doing what you want." The crowd murmured louder at that. People were starting to pick sides more openly now. Their faces turned either toward Luke with quiet sympathy or toward the woman with thinly veiled irritation. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap crossed his arms and shook his head. "Lady, let it go already," he called out. "It's a hat. You're the only one making a scene." The woman spun to glare at him, her voice shrill. "You let this go if you want, but I won't. It's about principle." "Principle?" Luke muttered, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You're screaming at a teenager over a piece of fabric. That's your principle?" Her face turned blotchy now, her eyes wild as she turned back to Luke, clearly grasping for control. "You just wait," she spat. "When I'm done here, you'll wish you'd never worn that hat. I'll call the cops if I have to." Luke's eyes widened at that, his pulse spiking. "You're joking, right?" "Not at all," she snapped. "Maybe you'll listen to them. If I have to call someone to make you learn some respect, I will." "You're gonna call the police because I'm wearing a hat?" "Yes," she barked without hesitation, her voice shaking with manic triumph. "And they'll deal with you how you deserve." The murmurs of the crowd turned into full-on whispers now, some incredulous, others openly critical. "She's lost her mind," someone muttered. "This is embarrassing." Gary, who looked like he might collapse from the stress, threw his hands up in surrender. "All right, enough. Both of you need to calm down. There's no need to call anyone over a—" But she was already pulling a phone from her pocket, her fingers flying over the screen as she glared daggers at Luke. "You think you can talk back to me like that? Call me a lunatic? We'll see how tough you are when the police show up." "Are you serious right now?" Luke asked, his voice low but incredulous. "You're calling the cops on me over this?" "I told you," she replied smugly, pressing the phone to her ear. "Actions have consequences." Luke's face burned with anger, but he forced himself to stay still, his hands balled into fists. He could feel the crowd's eyes on him, their murmurs loud in his ears as the woman began speaking to whoever picked up on the other end. "Yes, I'm in the parking lot of the hardware store," she said, her voice shifting into faux composure, though her words were clipped with anger. "There's a young man here causing a disturbance. He's being aggressive and refusing to leave." Luke's mouth fell open. "What? I didn't—" She held up a hand to silence him, turning away slightly as though he didn't deserve to hear her side of the conversation. "Yes, that's right. He's here wearing, well, political clothing, and it's upsetting people. He's refusing to cooperate. I feel unsafe." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A woman whispered sharply to her friend, "She's lying. I've been standing here the whole time. That kid hasn't done anything." Luke's heart pounded as he looked around, his pulse roaring in his ears. A storm of anger, frustration, and disbelief churned inside him, but he stayed rooted to the spot, his mind racing. The woman lowered the phone, slipping it back into her pocket with a smug smile. "They're on their way," she announced to the crowd, her chin lifting triumphantly. "Maybe now you'll learn what happens when you disrespect adults." Luke exhaled sharply, his face still red. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll have plenty of time to explain that to the police," she sneered. The crowd's discomfort was now unmistakable. Phones were up, faces were tense, and murmurs of dissent rippled through the bystanders. But the woman ignored it all, her self-satisfied expression making it clear she believed she'd already won. And as Luke stared her down, his heart pounding, he knew something she didn't. She'd just made a mistake she wouldn't forget. Luke's gaze was unwavering, his jaw tight as the woman crossed her arms and smirked, certain she had won. The crowd had grown thick now, spilling closer as the tension reached an unbearable peak. Murmurs surged through the onlookers like an undercurrent, some questioning her sanity, others criticizing her behavior, and a few whispering in defense of the teen. But none of it mattered to her. She turned slightly, throwing a condescending glance over her shoulder. "Oh, don't worry, kid," she cooed, her tone syrupy and sharp. "You'll thank me one day when you finally grow up and realize what respect looks like. I'm doing you a favor." Luke stared at her, anger bubbling just beneath his surface, but he stayed silent. He didn't need to say anything. The woman straightened, brushing her hands off as though she'd just completed a hard day's work. "The police will be here soon enough, and then we'll see how tough you are." She didn't notice the black SUV pulling up at the edge of the parking lot, its tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. Nor did she see the driver's door swing open as a tall figure emerged, dressed in crisp navy slacks and a neatly pressed shirt. But Luke saw, and for the first time that afternoon, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The crowd turned in unison, their murmurs giving way to hushed silence as the man approached. The woman kept talking, oblivious to the sudden shift in the air. "If kids like you had proper parenting, maybe we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of nonsense," she sneered. "It's disgraceful. Just wait until someone—" Her voice caught in her throat as the man cleared his throat loudly, stopping just behind her. She turned, startled, and the smug expression slid off her face like water. The man before her stood tall and calm, but there was a weight to his presence, a quiet authority that demanded attention. His gaze swept over her, pausing briefly on Luke before settling back on her with a look that was equal parts disappointment and scrutiny. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice even but firm. The woman blinked, stumbling over her words as she took a small step back. I was just addressing a situation," she stammered, her voice suddenly less certain. "This kid, he's my son," the man interjected calmly. Her mouth fell open. The crowd froze, a collective intake of breath passing through them like a ripple. Phones that had been recording shifted focus, angling to catch every second of what was unfolding. The woman stared at the man, confusion and disbelief written across her face. "Your son?" The man nodded, his face still calm but his eyes sharp. "Yes, my son. And I believe I heard you're calling the police on him." The woman's face turned an impressive shade of pale. She blinked rapidly, glancing between Luke and the man as though trying to piece together the situation. I didn't know, she stammered weakly. You thought what? The man pressed, his tone sharpening ever so slightly. You thought yelling at a teenager in public and threatening him over a hat was acceptable? It wasn't, she floundered, her hands flapping awkwardly at her sides. He was being disrespectful. That hat. It's offensive and The man held up a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. I've heard enough, he said curtly. He turned toward Luke then, his expression softening just a fraction. Are you all right, son? Luke nodded, his posture still straight but his relief palpable. Yeah, Dad, I'm fine. The crowd erupted into murmurs again, the realization spreading like wildfire. That's his dad? Who is that guy? Luke's calm demeanor suddenly made sense, and so did the woman's sudden look of sheer panic. The woman finally found her voice again, her tone trembling. Look, I didn't realize who he was, she sputtered. I just thought he was another one of those troublemakers, you know how kids are. I was just trying to do the right thing. The right thing, Luke's father repeated slowly, his voice dripping with disbelief. The right thing is to scream at a child you don't know in a parking lot, insult him, and then call the police on him? That's your idea of doing the right thing? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her face flushed deep red, and she looked around as though searching for anyone to back her up. But the crowd's faces told her everything she needed to know. Disapproval, judgment. Some people shook their heads. Others whispered to one another, not bothering to hide their disdain. Do you even know who I am? Luke's father asked then, his tone cutting through the silence. The woman swallowed hard. No, maybe you should, he interrupted. Because before you called the police on my son, you might have wanted to think this through. He stepped forward then, his eyes locked on her. My name is Governor Marcus Caldwell. The woman's jaw dropped. Another wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. The color drained from her face as the weight of his words hit her like a freight train. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Governor, someone from the crowd whispered. That's the governor? I didn't know, the woman stammered, her voice shaking. If I had known, I wouldn't have. That's the problem, isn't it? Marcus cut in sharply, his voice low but commanding. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with respect. You shouldn't need to know their family, their status, or their background. My son isn't just another troublemaker. He's a kid who didn't deserve the way you treated him today. The woman staggered back a step, her face ghostly pale. The crowd was silent now, all eyes fixed on her as the weight of the governor's words sank in. Phones were still recording, ensuring that her shame would live far beyond this moment. Marcus turned back to Luke, his voice softer now. Come on, son, he said. Let's get out of here. Luke nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to follow his father. He cast one final glance over his shoulder at the woman, whose face was still frozen in shock. The crowd began to part as Marcus and Luke walked toward the black SUV, the murmurs rising again as people processed what had just happened. The woman stood rooted to the spot, her hands shaking, the embarrassment rolling off her in waves. She had picked the wrong kid. The woman stood frozen in place, the crowd's murmurs growing louder as reality sank in. Phones stayed trained on her, capturing every second of her shame. Her face flushed beet red, her mouth opening and closing uselessly as though she could find a way to explain herself. But there was nothing to say. She called the police on the governor's kid? Someone whispered, a mixture of disbelief and amusement in their tone. Another voice chimed in, sharper this time. Serves her right. She brought this on herself. The woman spun toward the crowd, her frazzled hair whipping over her shoulders. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? She shrieked, her voice cracking. He didn't tell me who he was. An older woman in the crowd, standing near the front, tilted her head disapprovingly. He shouldn't have to tell you. You shouldn't treat people that way, title or not. The words cut through the air like a knife, slicing the woman's last shred of self-righteousness to ribbons. She turned back to the parking lot where the black SUV had just pulled away, Luke and his father disappearing into the distance. A chill settled over her as the weight of what she had done smothered her pride. "Maybe you'll think twice next time," a man called out, shaking his head in disgust. "Hope it was worth it." The woman let out a strangled sound, part anger and part desperation. She pointed an accusing finger at the crowd, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. This is all being blown out of proportion. It's his fault. He disrespected me, but no one was buying it." Gary, the store manager, finally stepped forward, his own frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "Ma'am, enough," he said, his voice sharper than before. "You need to leave. You've caused enough trouble here." The woman snapped toward him, her face twitching with disbelief. "I need to leave? You're siding with him after everything? You're the one who made a scene." Gary cut in firmly, gesturing toward the crowd, whose glares were now undeniable. "You harassed a kid for wearing a hat. Then you called the police. You've embarrassed yourself. And this store..." She staggered back, blinking hard. The humiliation was too much to bear. The onlookers watched her silently now, their judgment thick in the air. Phones were still raised. Every move she made, every word she spat, immortalized for anyone who cared to see. Her voice came out small now, pleading. "I didn't mean to what?" A woman near the front shot back. "Didn't mean to humiliate yourself? Didn't mean to act like a bully? Because you did. And now everyone's watching." The woman's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her like air from a punctured balloon. She glanced around helplessly, as if searching for someone to defend her, someone to save her from the shame she had created for herself. But there was no one. The crowd was done with her. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before opening your mouth," someone muttered as she turned to shuffle toward the store doors. Her steps were slow, defeated, and the whispers followed her like a shadow. As she disappeared inside, Gary exhaled deeply, turning toward the crowd. "All right, everyone," he called out, clapping his hands together. "Let's get back to our day. Nothing more to see here." Slowly, the onlookers began to disperse. The phones lowered, conversations started up again, and the hum of normalcy returned to the parking lot. But the mood had shifted. People shook their heads, exchanged knowing glances, and some smiled faintly as though justice had been served. "Man, that was wild," a teenager said to his friend, grinning as they walked away. "She's gonna go viral for sure." "Good," the friend replied, smirking. "Maybe she'll learn a lesson." We live in a world where first impressions can make or break us. But what happens when those impressions are clouded by judgment, assumptions, or anger? This woman's outburst, her blind indignation, and her refusal to back down showed us something we've all seen before: a rush to judge without knowing the full story. Her downfall wasn't just about who Luke's father turned out to be. It was about her behavior, her words, and her entitlement catching up with her. She wasn't just embarrassed because she harassed the son of a governor. She was embarrassed because her actions revealed her true colors for all to see. And the truth is, we've all been guilty of assumptions at one time or another. Maybe not in a way as extreme as this, but how often do we judge someone based on their clothes, their hat, their beliefs, or even just a look? This story is a wake-up call. Respect isn't conditional. It shouldn't matter if someone's a teenager, a stranger, or the governor's child. Treating others with dignity isn't about who they are. It's about who you are. So here's a question for you. How often do we let our biases get the better of us? Have you ever been in a situation where you judged someone unfairly? Or maybe someone judged you? Think about it. Because at the end of the day, our actions are what define us, not the people we judge. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you have stepped in to stop this woman? How would you have handled it if you were Luke? And if you took anything away from the story, hit that like button and share it. Maybe it'll remind someone else that kindness costs nothing, but judgment could cost you everything.